Is that better? Okay. So a couple of years ago, my colleague Sherry Aronson and I were asked to conduct a survey of what were existing housing strategies for adults with autism by a local autism research group in Phoenix. And so we began this long process of looking to see if there actually were any homes that were developed for people with autism. We found very few. So we began with doing a kind of an overview of, how many adults with autism are there actually out there, and we found that there's absolutely no reliable data. Although it's projected that in the next decade there will be about 500,000 American children with autism will enter adulthood. So there's going to be this, sort of huge population of people that are going to have these special requirements. Again, as you've probably seen elsewhere, the lifetime costs associated with autism, with the majority of these costs occurring in their adult lifespan. So, how can we figure out ways to make their living much more accessible and as independent as possible, and thereby also help to not only improve quality of life but cut down on expenses? So we looked at what are the issues that are problems for adults with autism to actually have more independent living. And of course there are the issues of perseverative behaviors, impulse control, planning ability, working memory, problem solving, the ability to negotiate new environments, mitigating environmental stimuli, and then also there's this issue of over-reliance on care providers that begins very early in life and starts to progress and be carried over into adulthood. Reduced functional independence that stems from that, which ultimately leads to a low quality of life among adults with autism. So the existing living arrangements that people with autism are now having is that they're living with their parents or with their older relatives and siblings, and that 25% of these primary caregivers are over the age of 60. So this presents a huge problem, not only in terms of parents being incredibly concerned about what's going to happen when they pass away, but also the problems of then having this adult move into a completely new environment. So in addition to the aging parents, there's also a very high turnover rate of qualified staff and care providers and a shortage of these providers. They're incredibly underpaid. The jobs are very difficult, and they're typically not supported very well. It's also, in terms of finding financing for housing, is very much a big challenge, as well as the service providers, and then have the dearth of appropriate housing. So we looked at, this is a study that was done by Easter Seals recently to look at where are these adults with autism living, and they found that indeed most are living with their parents or their guardians. So we looked at what are the resident mix that's currently out there in the housing that is available, and that we found that, yes, they're living with their family. They might have self-selected roommates for people who are living slightly more independently, or they might have roommates that are chosen by an agency or provider, such as in a group home. And then also, what type of mix is going on in the residential complex? Is it strictly people with developmental disabilities or people with autism, or is it mixed? Do we have people who are, typical folks mixing in, having some people who are with developmental disabilities or autism in the community? And then there's several types that you can find. You have detached homes, attached homes, clusters, homes that have 2 to 5 units, 6 units with no common shared spaces, 6 plus units with common shared places, or attached efficient units or guest rooms in homes. Sort of this new kind of thing of the foster home that seems to be popping up. And then out of that, there are several types of residential care and support that are happening. The supported living, which is something that's directed by the client, the person, the adult with the ASD, and these can either be leased or self-owned homes. And then in this particular instance, the caregivers live off-site but are available to come in and assist the person as needed. Supervised living, where you have 1 or 2 individuals with autism living within a unit, again, leased or self-owned, but the caregivers live on site 24 hours to support them in everything that they might need. Group homes, supervised living for 6 or fewer residents, with, again, on-site care providers. And out of this is one particularly interesting model, the family teaching model, which I'll talk briefly about in a minute. And then transitional living. This is an example of this is where people might live for just a few years as they prepare to go out and then have have their own homes, live more independently, and it would be a really intensive sort of life skills training course or go to a university or something like this. And so we looked at over 100 different residential options within the U.S. and visited 12 actual sites to see what they were doing and looking at these various different levels of support. And this is a graph that sort of shows how that support ranges. And one of the big issues is that this is one of the groups we looked at, the Hallmark Community Solutions, is that how to have service provision within the home. And when the service provider actually owns the home, it becomes highly problematic for people with autism because they're not good with change. And if the service provider becomes not so great, then what happens is the individual with autism has to move out and go through this sort of difficult transition again. So that those become really problematic issues when you're trying to figure out how do you develop housing for adults with autism. So an example of supported living is the community housing for adult independence in Boston, Massachusetts, where they have several units that are set-asides within a condo complex where the units are owned, and these people are mixing, the adults with autism are mixing right in with typical residents, so there's kind of good things and bad things about that. If the typical residents do not understand the issues surrounding how a person with autism might work, that can cause some problems. But otherwise, it can be a very positive thing. Supervised living. This is Lincoln Oaks. It's actually one that's completely government funded, and the people here all are living on a very low wage that is provided through Social Security in the U.S. All the people in this particular complex have developmental disabilities, with several of them having autism. The middle photograph shows the apartment of an individual with autism who has high-functioning autism and has a job. The good thing about these is that there's a community room and a computer room so that it fosters a lot of sort of interaction among the individuals that live there. And in some of the two-bedroom units, you actually have an individual with autism who's living there with their care provider 24/7. We have an on-site manager, although that person is strictly only dealing with the building and not with any kind of service provision. You have group homes. This is one of 60 group homes that's developed by the Hallmark Community Solutions. This has 4 persons with developmental disabilities as well as physical disabilities. They put them in established neighborhoods so that they are kind of embedded right into the existing community. Each person has their own bedroom with individualized climate control. There's bathrooms and staff office, which is one thing we kept coming across. It was very important for the staff to have good working conditions in order to facilitate them staying longer. And it needed to be away from the residents so that they could have a break. And then this one has 24-hour support.